All right. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are joining us from across the continent and around the world. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Yvonne Okwara, and I'll be your moderator for this session. It is really good to have you here today. And happy International Women's Day that's coming up, and happy International Women's Month. And welcome to our session here today. We are following on the theme of the International Women's Day of 2024, which is investing in women and accelerating progress. And we're very thankful to our hosts. That's the UN Women, East and Southern Africa, West and Central Africa, as well as the Arab states. And very thankful as well to the partners for this event. That's Data2X, UN's Economic Commission for Africa, and the Africa Development Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank the co-directors of this program, Dominique Kanobana, who leads the Making Every Woman and Girl Count program in the Arab States region. Thank you very much for helping us put this together and for directing this. Also, many thanks as well to Isabella Schmidt, who's the Regional Gender Statistics Advisor for East and Southern Africa at UN Women. Now, today we're going to talk about what it means to invest in women and accelerating that progress. But you cannot do that if you don't have data, if you don't have information. So do we understand what's going on the ground? Are we gathering that data? Are we disseminating that data in the right way? And are we disseminating it to the people that need to make decisions in terms of policy, legislation, and most importantly, investment? So we're going to have a conversation that takes a look at the nexus of that whole value chain of gender data and how to make it count and how to make it impactful on the ground. So looking forward to that. You'll be hearing about gender-based budgeting. That is how you use that data to budget in the right way, in the right programs, and invest it properly. You'll also be hearing about how gender data is being used as a driver for change by those in the media and how that is impacting our lives every day and better storytelling. And then we'll also be hearing about shifting to a care society. Again, you need data in there, measuring and monitoring what that means in the space of the purple economy. So that is what we'll be doing here this morning. And I'm very grateful to all of you for joining in. Just to remind you as well, we are streaming live on YouTube. So thank you very much for that. So let me begin by introducing the remarks, the welcoming remarks from one of our event partners, that's Data2X. Ladies and gentlemen, let's listen now to Krista Jones-Baptista, who's the Executive Director at Data2X.
Hello, distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and participants from around the world. Welcome to this event organized by the UN Women's Gender Data and Statistics Program, and I'm glad to be here and able to deliver this message. My name is Krista Jones-Baptista, and I'm the Executive Director of Data2X, a global gender data alliance that builds the case and mobilizes action for gender data. I would like to first express my sincere gratitude to each of you for your time and your presence with us. Your presence here reflects a shared commitment to advancing gender equality and empowering women across the African continent and beyond. Today, we gather not only to celebrate International Women's Day, but also to delve into crucial discussions about investing in women, leveraging gender data, and fostering inclusive practices. These conversations are pivotal for accelerating progress towards Africa's Agenda 2063 and the Global Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030 commits to achieving gender equality and empowerment. However, this remains a formidable challenge, exacerbated by the far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing geopolitical conflicts and climate disasters, pushing millions into severe poverty. It's in this context that we all work, and at Data2X, we believe strongly in the power of collaboration and partnership. This event is a testament to our shared commitment to fostering collaboration among diverse sector players, including the media, private sector, national statistics offices, public agencies, civil society organizations, and development partners. It will take all of us to bring on the change we want to see. Our discussions today are timely as we confront a stark reality, a staggering U.S. $360 billion annual deficit in spending on gender equality measures. The urgency is echoed by this year's CSW 68 focus, which is on accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. Gender data is crucial for understanding the realities of women, girls, and gender diverse communities, measuring progress on gender equality and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Chronic underinvestment in gender data systems poses a significant challenge. An estimated $500 million annually is needed to adequately fund core gender data systems by 2030. Despite rising support for gender equality, global financing for gender data dropped by 55% in 2020. This gap jeopardizes progress, as more than 25% of SDG indicators for gender equality are off track. Urgent action and increased political will are essential to bridging this funding gap and prioritizing gender data for meaningful progress. A crucial part of successfully investing in women is increasing gender data's policy relevance by fostering connections between data producers and users along the data value chain. That means strengthening the capacities of both political and technical actors to analyze, interpret, and communicate gender data. It also means supporting national statistical offices to map and articulate their investment needs to stimulate donor and domestic resource mobilization. But no single country, donor, or organization can lead the charge on financing for gender data on their own. It's only in partnership and collaboration across geographies, sectors, and disciplines that we can spur a movement to put gender data prioritization at the heart of gender equality progress. And that's why today's conversation is so pivotal to closing the gender data financing gap and ensuring progress on gender equality and the Sustainable Development Goals. At Data2X, we stand behind this principle of collaboration. We lead the Gender Data Network, working alongside our partners. The GDN is an alliance of 22 active participants within Africa alone, working with Africa's national statistics offices in partnership with UNECA, Paris 21, and Open Data Watch. This collaborative effort demonstrates the benefits of bolstering capacity and effectively leveraging gender data for the formulation of impactful gender equality policies. We now have expanded this network into Asia, a joint venture with UNSCAP and our partners, where together we aim to ignite policy demand, connect gender data champions globally, and propel progress. This example, alongside the many initiatives we'll hear about today, provides us with a collective set of use cases and models for the change we want to see. And I hope that we'll explore the transformative role that gender data can play as a catalyst for driving progress across various sectors. By prioritizing gender-responsive budgeting and shifting towards a care society, we aim to pave the way for a more equitable and inclusive future. I'm genuinely excited about the wealth of knowledge and perspectives that will be shared today. And we hope these discussions will inform and inspire concrete actions towards a more gender-inclusive future. And once again, thank you for being part of this event. And I encourage each of us to actively participate, share insights, and engage in the enriching conversations throughout this event. Together, let us invest in women and accelerate progress towards a more equitable world.
Krista, thank you very much for those opening remarks and indeed for just helping us understand a big part of why we're here today, closing that gender data financing gap. But it's important. We're going to hear, like Krista said, from various sectors and disciplines and to see what's working, where the challenges lie, but also some great work that has been done in some regions that can perhaps be emulated, adopted in others. And now to help us frame this event, somebody had mentioned earlier who's the co-director of this program, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dominique Kanobana, who is leading this Making Every Woman and Girl Count in the Arab States region. A man who has had great experience in large-scale surveys, gender data production, but most importantly, census implementation. Dominique, welcome.
Thank you, Yvonne. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear. Proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne Okoa, for introducing me. Dear Special Representative of UN Women to AU and ECA, Executive Director of Data to X, Representative of African Development Bank, distinguished participants, all protocol observed, good morning. The UN Women East and Southern Africa Regional Office, the West African Regional Office, and Arab states are very happy to have you with us today during this important roundtable conversation entitled Gender Data, a Secure Investment for Accelerated Progress. Why are we here? We are here to discuss the importance of investing in gender data production and use in Africa that will facilitate an evidence-based investment in women. Gender data makes the invisible women and girls visible. Gender data are key to achieving gender equality and empowerment for women and girls around the world and in Africa in particular. Gender data enables policymakers and businesses to take evidence-based decisions that increase women's well-being, access to economic opportunities, and overall development outcomes. Gender data and statistics are lacking worldwide and in Africa in particular. Without these data, the needs of women and girls may be overlooked, and women and girls left behind in policymaking for sustainable development. Tackling the root causes of gaps in data and statistics is essential, as is building skills and capacity to collect and use gender data. Gender data gaps exist across the world in countries of all income levels, and the data for reporting on SDG 5 lags behind all other SDGs, with only 56% according to of indicators covered through existing data according to UN Women. Although coverage is improving, in 2022, UN Women projected it will take 22 years to close the SDG gender data gap, making it difficult to assess and monitor the direction and pace of progress for women and girls. UN Women has been working since 2017 with country, regional, and global partners on mainstreaming gender in our programming, guidance, and tools to improve the representation of women and girls in data and statistics through our flagship program, Making Every Woman and Girl Count. The 2024 International Women's Day theme, Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress, recognizes the crucial role of financing in closing the gender gap, both for sustainable development and in keeping with Africa's development priorities as articulated in Agenda 2063. In light of the foregoing, this International Women's Day, UN Women join sector actors in calling for investing in women to accelerate progress, specifically through 3 points. 1, investing in gender data as a vehicle for driving progress for all. 2, prioritizing gender-responsive budgeting. And 3, shifting to a green economy and care society. On the first point, investing in gender data as a vehicle for driving change, investing in gender data is investing in women to accelerate progress. With less than 6 years to SDG target of 2030, the need to produce relevant and quality data for gender indicators to monitor progress towards the SDGs is greater than ever. Investing in gender statistics to close the gaps is in adequately monitoring implementation of the SDGs is a fundamental step to improving the lives of women and girls. Worldwide, 500 million USD is needed from donors every year until 2030 to adequately fund core gender data systems. In 2021, less than half of countries had data available to monitor SDG 5. Fewer still regularly collected that data over time. We cannot change what we do not measure, and reliable gender data is the only way to properly establish the status of women and girls in Africa. On the second point of prioritizing gender-responsive budgeting, gender-responsive budgeting brings together gender equality and public financial management, two aspects that are not commonly associated. It seeks to improve the result of budgets in general and to advance gender equality and women's empowerment by focusing on key economic and social issues that are often overlooked or obscured in conventional budget and policy analysis and decision-making. GRB can be enhanced, for example, by creating data systems that will enable planners to access and use gender data for policy formulation, planning, monitoring, and resource allocation, and undertaking GRB analysis that can contribute towards improving gender statistics by including the component in statistical reports. On the third point on shifting to the care society and implementing gender-responsive financing, the current economic system exacerbates poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation, disproportionately affecting women and marginalized groups. Advocates for alternative economic model propose a shift towards a green economy and care society that amplifies women's voices. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Dominique, thank you very much for framing this event and telling us all why we are here today. I particularly like what you said about you cannot change what you cannot measure. And I think, therefore, you cannot monitor what you have not measured. And that is important, especially as we race towards 2030. And we thought 2030 was far away. It's now less than 6 years. And 2063 is not too far away either. And of course, all those years to come, I think, the need to be able to continue to close the gap is important every day, not just over the next 6 years, over the next 10 or 20 years. It's a very important and immediate need. Thank you for framing our event here today. And we'll be hearing a lot more from our various other panelists. I also just want to remind everybody that this is an extremely interactive session. We hope to be able to hear from many of you. You are joined here. There is our Q&A section. Please, you know what, let's start by just telling us who you are and where you are from. In the Q&A section, I already see Bazel Stephen. We'll get to that in a moment. You can also put in your questions, your comments as we go along, and we'll try and incorporate them throughout this conversation. Next, to give our keynote speech is a woman with over 30 years experience in international development, and also serves as UN Women Resident Representative, or did in Côte d'Ivoire. Antonia Ngabala Sodonon is currently the UN Women Special Representative, and she's the interim heading UN Women Liaison Office to the African Union and the ECA, that's the UN's Economic Commission for Africa, to give us the keynote speech here today. Antonia, over to you.
Merci beaucoup Yvonne, chers panélistes et chers participants. Au nom d'ONU Femmes, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette table ronde virtuelle, en prélude de la Journée internationale des femmes, sous le thème « Investir en faveur des femmes, accélérer le rythme ». Je salue la collaboration et le solide partenariat entre ONU Femmes Data2X, la Banque africaine de développement et la Commission économique pour l'Afrique, qui a permis d'organiser cet événement virtuel majeur. Chers collègues, chers invités et participants, je suis certaine que cette table ronde nous permettra d'établir des discussions fructueuses, d'apprendre des expériences de pays champions, mettant en place des politiques essentielles pour briser le statu quo des inégalités qui empêchent aux filles et aux femmes de réaliser leur plein potentiel. Aujourd'hui, en l'honneur de la journée de commémoration de nos années de lutte pour le droit des femmes, je suis honorée de voir de plus en plus d'acteurs, particulièrement des médias et du secteur privé, s'impliquer davantage pour l'autonomisation et le respect des droits des filles et des femmes. Que cela soit la société civile, les organisations internationales, le secteur privé, les organisations non gouvernementales, les médias, avec l'impulsion des gouvernements, l'engagement public et les volontés politiques pour changer les conditions des filles et des femmes, ils se rejoignent et se font entendre de plus en plus. Toutefois, chers participants, chers panélistes, honorables invités, toutefois, l'égalité de sexe reste à ce jour le plus grand défi en matière de droits de l'homme. Cette égalité ainsi que l'autonomisation des filles et des femmes reflétée à travers l'ODD5 de l'agenda 2030, fondement essentiel pour atteindre l'ensemble des ODD, souffre énormément d'un manque de moyens. En effet, malgré le fait que les études montrent que la participation des femmes à toutes les échelles, à tous les niveaux, grâce à l'amélioration de leur statut, garantit un meilleur développement humain des sociétés, ainsi que le développement économique de nos communautés, de nos pays, il existe encore un large défaut, un large manque d'investissement en faveur des femmes, avec un déficit annuel de 360 milliards de dollars dans les dépenses consacrées aux mesures en faveur de l'avancement de l'égalité des sexes. Chers participants, en plus des inégalités connues auxquelles les femmes et les filles sont déjà confrontées de manière tellement forte, nous avons vu que ces dernières années, ces femmes et ces filles ont subi de plein fouet des chocs et des crises qui exacerbent violemment et fragilisent davantage leur situation. Les conséquences de la COVID-19 et des conflits armés, ainsi que des catastrophes naturelles liées à la crise climatique, aggravent les obstacles à l'accès des droits des femmes et des filles. De plus, des secteurs émergents liés à l'innovation, la technologie, les sciences et les emplois verts produiront des métiers et opportunités importantes pour l'avenir. Dès à présent, il est nécessaire d'investir dans des politiques et des stratégies pour inclure les femmes et les filles dans ces secteurs, afin de ne pas les laisser en rade encore une fois. Aujourd'hui, chères assemblées, c'est une occasion pour nous rappeler que nous devons tous ensemble redoubler d'efforts et rappeler les droits des femmes. Montrer où nous devons nous concentrer davantage et aussi commémorer tout ce qui a été bien fait. Merci pour votre constance et votre engagement envers ces objectifs. Mais retenons bien que l'investissement dans les femmes est une question de droits de l'homme, de droits humains, mais aussi une condition préalable à tout progrès en matière de développement durable. En outre, chers panélistes, chers participants et participantes, si la situation des femmes demeure invisible, comment serait-il possible d'accroître les financements pour améliorer leur autonomie et la réalisation de leurs droits? Dès lors, il est crucial de fournir des efforts visant à assurer la production et l'utilisation de statistiques de genre de qualité. En 2021, moins de la moitié des pays disposaient de données pour évaluer les progrès d'avancement de réalisation de l'ODD5 sur l'égalité des sexes. En effet, nous ne pouvons pas changer ce que nous ne pouvons pas mesurer, cela a été dit. Et des données fiables sur le genre sont le seul moyen d'établir correctement le statut des femmes et des filles en Afrique. Dès lors, investir dans les statistiques de genre pour combler les lacunes dans le suivi adéquat de la mise en œuvre des ODD5 est une étape fondamentale pour améliorer la vie des femmes et des filles. En ce qui concerne le financement dans les statistiques de genre, à l'échelle mondiale, les donateurs doivent fournir 500 millions de dollars par an jusqu'en 2030. pour financer de manière adéquate les systèmes de données de base sur le genre. Actuellement, ni les pays ni les donateurs internationaux ne fournissent l'investissement nécessaire. Le niveau de l'aide au développement pour les statistiques de genre n'augmente pas suffisamment pour mettre en place des systèmes solides de statistiques de genre dans les pays à revenus faibles et intermédiaires. Le financement des programmes de promotion de l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes devrait également inclure le financement des données relatives à l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes. En plus de l'investissement dans les statistiques de genre, l'Afrique et les États arabes ont compris la nécessité d'investir davantage dans la budgétisation sensible au genre. Celle-ci vise à améliorer les résultats des budgets en général et à faire progresser l'égalité des sexes et l'autonomisation des femmes, en se concentrant spécifiquement sur des questions économiques et sociales clés qui sont souvent négligées ou occultées dans l'analyse et la prise de décisions budgétaires et politiques conventionnelles. Aujourd'hui, grâce aux expériences de différents pays, il nous sera possible de découvrir comment renforcer la budgétisation sensible au genre, qui pourrait aussi contribuer à l'amélioration des statistiques de genre, en incluant cette composante dans les rapports statistiques. À travers les discussions à l'ordre du jour, ensemble, nous apprendrons aussi l'importance et l'intérêt d'investir dans des modèles alternatifs d'économie, intégrant une économie verte et de soins, prenant en compte le travail et les soins non rémunérés. Au final, en définitive, pour l'ONU Femmes, l'amélioration positive et durable du statut des filles et des femmes est un sacerdoce. Nous nous engageons à continuer à travailler d'arrache-pied avec les gouvernements, les organisations de femmes, les organisations de la société civile, le secteur privé, les médias, les institutions académiques et toutes les forces vives afin de lutter pour l'autonomisation des femmes et des filles à toute échelle. À travers cette table ronde, je vous exhorte à participer activement aux discussions, à partager vos succès et vos meilleures pratiques et à mettre en exergue les opportunités pour les acteurs d'investir en faveur des filles et des femmes dans leurs sphères d'influence respectives. Je vous invite à agir dès à présent pour accélérer nos efforts et les investissements en vue de permettre à chaque fille, chaque femme, de bénéficier de l'égalité des chances, de l'égalité des opportunités et de l'égalité des droits. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention. Merci beaucoup, Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sordanan, for your remarks and introducing us to the community of practice. We are now moving into our next section, and we will begin by tackling each of the three topics that mentioned. Remember how we use gender data as a vehicle for change, how gender data is being used in gender responsive budgeting. And finally, we'll be taking a look at the purple economy and how gender data can be helpful in that respect. Again, just a reminder that there is the Q&A section where you can interact with us. I think I've seen one there from Basil Stephen talking about the gender data that is missing, particularly for women in pastoralist communities. And of course, there's interaction there. There's lots of interaction that can happen there between us and amongst ourselves. And in fact, my next speaker is one of those who's contributed to that. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like us to now begin our first conversation of the day with the first topic, that's investing in gender data as a vehicle for driving change. So how are members of the media using gender data to tell stories better, and stories that can have impact, not just on the communities to raise awareness, but also to drive policy change? And to introduce this section, ladies and gentlemen, let's have Isabella Schmidt, who's the Regional Gender Statistics Advisor for East and Southern Africa at UN Women. Ms. Isabella Schmidt.
I need to unmute. Good morning, welcome to the webinar. This is, as you know, usually Q1 when we have our community of practice meeting. We open it to the continent and we partner with West and Central Africa offices, as well as this time for the first time with the Arab State offices of UN Women. So welcome to everyone, and I'm happy to see so many of you in the room. So I'm just briefly going to highlight some of the achievements we've had so far in the area of funding gender data and statistics initiatives. I think a lot of the conversation is about the gaps, but there's also some good news. And I think happy to be joined by the media in this short introductory session, because I think the media can be bringers of both bad and good news, and they play an extremely important role in how we communicate gender data, but also how we can amplify the gaps and the needs, especially when it comes to policy and strategic interventions that are needed as a result of the findings of some of our studies. But just briefly, many of you will know that in the last 5 years, we've managed to do significant interventions related to gender data and statistics. We've done the first ever Kenya time use survey. The findings have been used to influence policy and a whole care policy in Kenya. We've supported several demographic and health surveys that produce gender-based violence data. And we are currently, as we speak, with other partners rolling out a time use survey in Malawi, raising money for a similar survey in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. In Nigeria, we are also about to embark on data collection around time use. So several statistical offices in the sub-region have started publishing reports on the situation of women and men who have not done so before. And so there are instances where we can really say we are moving forward, but the gaps remain, and the gaps are quite significant. And I think bringing this collaborative together and all the other people who've joined, not necessarily from the collaborative, gives us an opportunity to really think a little bit more about this, not just in terms of what is missing, but also in terms of what we've achieved and how far we've come in the last 5 years. So thanks for the introduction, Yvonne. I'm going to hand over to the media colleagues who's also going to contribute towards the value of gender data in terms of the.
Thank you, Isabella, for that. And like you say, the media are an important asset and facet of that. So let me begin straight away with our first participant and our first panelist, John Alanamu, who is the founder and CEO of Africa Uncensored. It is Africa's first and only indigenous dedicated investigative journalism media house. John Alanamu is a CNN Africa Journalist of the Year, Trace Prize winner 2019, and is a well-known human rights defender in Kenya and across the continent. John, let me just begin by asking you how your interaction with gender data and how you've used it. I know Kenya has been struggling with issues around femicide, particularly. Many women have been, killed recently in some rather brutal fashion. You've been at the forefront of this, but tell us how you are able to use this gender data. Is it adequate? How are you getting it? And how does it inform your storytelling?
So, first of all, thanks for having me on this panel. Gender data, unfortunately, is not as adequate as we'd have hoped for it to be. There are, various organizations, for instance, the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics, as well as other organizations that count certain things and try and gender them, but these are mostly for economic progress and other social markers. But when it comes to some of the stories that we've been interested in, we've found that we've had to count and gather data for ourselves. So to your example on femicide, in collaboration with the Africa Data Hub, which is based in South Africa, and our partners here, Odipo Dev, two data insights companies, we created a data set on femicide that goes back to 2016 in Kenya. And the experience there has been a good one in terms of being able to first create that data set that's available not just to us for our own reporting, but to everyone who would like to use it. And it has been used quite widely since it was launched in January, since the website was launched in January. I think that's the question, though, is or rather the next question should be around nuance, right? So the data set that we collected is really hard numbers around the number of women killed, the partners involved. But it doesn't go into the reasons. It doesn't go into some of those questions that ordinarily wouldn't be asked in these kinds of surveys. And I think that's where we should go. When thinking about how to be able to get an adequate understanding or a fuller understanding of the society that we're in, we should be thinking about those questions that aren't ordinarily asked when it comes to questions like femicide. So, for instance, if you were to target men specifically, questions to ask might be what really are your own attitudes around femicide? Give practical examples, of situations that we've seen in the public sphere before. Perhaps even put people in situations where they really have to think and question the values that they have. That gives us richer insight, richer information, and it leads our storytelling. On femicide, for instance, what that's done is that it's really helped enrich our understanding of the nature of relationships in our country, as well as the nature of killings, and this can then lead to more targeted interventions by other organizations. The data set, for instance, talked about intimate partner violence as being the or rather intimate partner relationships as being the two places where women are killed or harmed in instances of intimate partner violence. That challenges a very widely held narrative that by some people that women who are attacked and often become victims of femicide are not in relationships, are perhaps in casual or transactional relationships. That then throws it into sharp relief against the actual data and allows us to have a richer discussion. But I think gender data can be about anything, right? And I think the better we understand our society by asking these questions and by counting, the better stories we can tell. We've been gathering data on corruption, for instance, since 1978. And one of the interesting categories that we thought would be interesting to look at would be the number of corruption scandals that have been initiated or have men versus women at the center of it. What then that might be able to explain is for instance, a number of women at the levels within the public space, because that's mostly what we're looking at, that do engage in these kinds of crimes. That again leads to more nuanced and more targeted interventions in terms of storytelling. But for now, I think we really can do a lot more. I think there was one of the speakers prior to me that talked about investment in data. And this unfortunately comes at a time when especially legacy media across Africa, across the world, is struggling with being able to keep the lights on. So if you're struggling to keep the lights on, you're struggling to maintain your staff, then going the next step beyond day one reporting of events as we experience them becomes very, very difficult. This is where I think, interlocutory organizations like the UN, people whose job and whose interest it is to really count and gather very nuanced data, can be helpful in supplying the media with the right kind of story data that then now helps with other narratives. But I think the other place to start looking in terms of where the impact of this kind of data can be is in new media and new platforms where people of all shades are interacting on a daily basis and try to tell those stories there, right? So if we're talking about the very credible and real assertions about the growth of TikTok, for instance, across the continent, then the growth of storytelling around specific gender issues should be very focused there where the people are. And also be focused on constantly polling and asking members of our audience and members of the public what it is about their lives that are impacted in one way or another, that then can be seen and dissected through a gender lens that might be able to guide gender budgeting, right? Gender-sensitive budgeting, that might be able to then also, bring to the level of the presidency and regional and continental discussions, the question of how to be able to bring more women on board where there are gaps, and also include men in places where they are falling behind. And I guess my final thought on that would be, that's one of the things that perhaps we haven't done very well in terms of crimes against women, gender-based crimes. There isn't a very rich data set around the reasons that men engage in these crimes, the attitudes that men hold that then would lead them to, to perpetrate these kinds of crimes. And by then asking those questions of that gender, then perhaps we could be able to have a richer discussion going forward and have, better solutions. But as it stands, we are some way along the way, but not where we should be, Yvonne.
Yeah, thanks, John, for highlighting that. I want to bring in our next speaker. That is Christine Mungai, who's a 2018 Newman Fellow at Harvard University, and is also the lead curator at Baraza Media Lab, which is a space that supports and promotes public interest storytelling. Christine, there's something that John has talked about, which is nuance lacking in the data. So data sets are important for the sheer numbers, but I wonder if there is a way that data can be taken forward and dig deeper beyond just numbers. What is your experience with data storytelling and the data that is available to enable you tell more nuanced stories that have greater impact? Christine.
Thank you, Yvonne. That's a really good question, and it has made me think of a story that I was involved in sometime last year. So I'm a part-time media trainer for Thomson Reuters Foundation, and last year we had a cohort that we took through sexual and reproductive health training. And as a result of that training, the journalists that we were mentoring pitched some story ideas that we encouraged them to ground them in existing data. So I want to talk about one story which answers your question on how to actually move the data forward, apart from it just being numbers on a spreadsheet. Where is the story, right? So Nation journalist, her name is Mary Agatha Gishana. She and I were looking through DHS data, so Demographic and Health Survey. That is a really rich data set that comes out every few years. And one of the things that stood out was on contraceptive use in Kenya. And on this DHS sheet, we looked at tubal ligation, so permanent sterilization in women. And something that immediately jumped out to me was that the rate of TLs in Kenya is twice as high in the rural areas as it is in urban areas. And that women who had only a primary level education were almost twice as likely to be permanently sterilized as opposed to women who had secondary and higher. This really made me ask a lot of questions because I know that a TL, a tubal ligation, is actually a surgical procedure. So I asked myself, how is it that in a country like Kenya, with unequal healthcare access, rural to urban, of course, urban areas are better served by hospitals and by facilities. The question is, how is it that TLs can be twice as high in rural areas and among less educated women? So Mary Agatha and I spent some time, asking ourselves some questions, and credit to her, she has a great reporting instinct. And so what she did is that she started asking around, and it was really the start of a story that ended up winning an award. It just was recently announced as the CAS Media Award for Local Journalism. And her story was about forced sterilization among HIV positive women. So this is something that is really underreported in Kenya, that in a country that, there are drugs now to manage HIV, and women can have full and healthy lives. But something really sinister, emerges through her storytelling that, she talked to a number of women who were kind of coerced, forced sterilization of HIV positive women. They were told that, no, this is just part of a normal cesarean section, right? Only to find out later that this had been done without their consent. They were not given all the information that they needed. Some of it was just outright coercion. They said, if we don't sterilize you, then we cannot support you with antenatal care, with formula for the baby, with nutrition advice, with postpartum visits, and so for me, that data set was really the start of a much bigger story. It doesn't fully explain that discrepancy that jumped out to me in the data, that the reason why TL's tubal ligations are much higher in rural Kenya than in urban areas is because of it being coerced somehow. But like I'm saying, it doesn't fully explain that. I wouldn't say that it does, but the data was the starting point of this, I would say, data investigation story. And so Mary Agatha's work really just took that number out of the spreadsheet and located it in the real world, in real people's lives. And I don't think we would have started even that story if it was not for that data set, right? Of figuring out why is it that in Kenya, poor, rural, less educated women tend to have a rate of tubal ligation that is twice as high as their counterparts who are urban, more wealthy and more educated. Big questions there. And for me, I think that's one of the things that makes our work in journalism quite fulfilling, and especially in starting with the data, that sometimes the story is kind of right there in front of you, but if you don't know how to recognize it, or if you don't know what to do with it, then some things will never emerge and they'll never be apparent. But if you have a strong reporter like Gishana or others that I've worked with in the past, that data set actually is the start of a conversation, a bigger story, something for folks to carry forward. And like I said, this story actually won an award for local journalism, and so is really shifting the conversation of what it means to actually pay attention to the kind of care that vulnerable women in Kenya are getting as part of their antenatal care.
This is interesting. So I want to conclude this particular session, and I want to give each of you a minute. That's you, Christine and John. Christine, I'll start with you. So what type of data do you want to see that enables you as the disseminator of information and the storyteller, that would make your storytelling better and perhaps more impactful? And, is there enough collaboration between those that produce the data and you, the disseminator of the information? Just if you can wrap that up in 1 minute about what more needs to happen to enable you tell the stories better that drive change.
Yeah, definitely not enough collaboration, that's for sure. I've been working with data my whole career as a journalist. And in some of the contexts that I've worked, I think it's getting better with time. I see more of our younger colleagues being much more comfortable working in data than was the case when we started out. Having a 300-page report thrown at you was very daunting, back then. But now I see younger journalists actually call themselves data journalists, which was not a thing when we started out a decade plus ago. So just to echo what John Allen said earlier, I think there shouldn't be an assumption that gender data means women data, that men are also gendered subjects, right? That gender applies to men as well, and figuring out men's positionality, their motivations, their reasons, their experiences as well, as a gendered category, not as a general category, not as a universal category that what happens to men is what happens to people, but instead it should be as gendered as it is for women, that women are looked at as a kind of specific category. And I think men should be looked at in that gendered way as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Christine. John?
The great thing about speaking after Christine is that she's given half my answer already. So I think all I'd add is really just reiterate data that asks why. So it's not just hard statistics about what's happened, but why it's happened or what's happening around the data that's being gathered. And I think secondly, data that's less driven by programmatic outcomes and more about what the genuine interests of the public are. I think we'd receive or we get more nuanced answers if we're less blinkered by the kind of programmatic way in which we align our focuses globally. Now, this is not to say that it doesn't have, to think about outcomes around water, etc., aren't useful, but I think if you, for a moment, thought about what the actual community needs are and start by asking, why and what, and those questions that are allowed to get more nuance, then even the programs and the interventions that non-governmental organizations, institutions like the United Nations, even governments, I think they'd have better outcomes because they'd be, to borrow this phrase, they'd be working on achieving outcomes that are genuinely people-centered. So, to give a quick example, if a road is less important to a community than a place to gather, an economist might tell you that local economy is opened up by a road, but the social interactions from that community might tell you different. And so this is the kind of data that I think would really enrich every discussion, not just gender discussions, but especially gender discussions. Yeah, I think I'll wind up there.
Thank you very much to both of you. Interesting insights there from John Alanamu and Christine Mungai. I thank you both for your time. People-centered data, data that asks why, data that also takes into account the other gender set that we have got. Thank you both for doing that. There's some good feedback already, and I encourage us to keep that coming. Hazel Gooding says, excellent illustration of why it's critical to interrogate the data. Vanilda Furtado says, good data is a starting point of good and inclusive policies. Very interesting, Christine, and I hope they have used it for good changes. And just like John Allen said, well, do people need a road or do they need a place to gather? And perhaps it is information like that and data like that that then ensures better outcomes and more targeted specific interventions. Thank you both for your time on that one. I want to also take a look at, still on this issue of using gender data as a vehicle for driving change. Our next speaker is Rurihose Florian, who's the deputy head of the Gender Monitoring Office at Rwanda's Gender Monitoring Office. And he's a man who's passionate about rural development and education, as well as some innovative strategies to eliminate violence against women and girls in all segments of society. Just a reminder for those of us that there's interpretation, you can check that button and choose English or French for the appropriate one for you. Rurihose?
Hello? I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much, Yvonne. And yeah, first of all, I'm happy to be part of a panel that you moderate. I appreciate your TV emissions, and I appreciate that, and I also have very happy to be part of this discussion. And I also thank the UN Women Africa for supporting Rwanda, and especially the Rwanda Gender Monitoring Office. And so we are honored to be part of these discussions. I also thank the previous speakers, the points that they have raised. And I'm going to talk about how Rwanda has invested in gender data following by the guidance that we were given by our president, His Excellency Paul Kagame, who told us that it could take decades to achieve gender equality if we maintain working on the pace that we had. So he challenged us that we have to do things differently and with a sense of urgency. That is why the country has the main two institutions that are mandated to produce gender data. That is the National Institute of Statistics and the Gender Monitoring Office. The Gender Monitoring Office, which has the main mandate of streaming and fight against gender-based violence in public sector, in civil society organizations, in private, and in and our main mandate is main mandate is to be, of course, that we work closely with the National Institute of Statistics. What we have done so far is to the main work is to establish the systems and mechanisms to collect data and analyze them and disseminate them, and making sure that different sectors use the same data that we have produced. So we conduct research. We also conduct gender profiles and gender thematic reports and country status reports that collect data, analyze them, and disseminate them using the gender management information system that helps different government institutions, but also the partners, and our development partners to put in place strategies, program, policies that promote gender equality and women's empowerment. We also conduct gender assessments and gender audits, all of them that aims to seek accountability to gender equality and gender-based violence service delivery. If I give an example of what we have been able to achieve as a country, the data analysis and dissemination that we have conducted over the past 10 years has contributed to establishing evidence of progress, or also gaps, because also highlight the gaps that we have in different sectors. And the same has contributed to gender inclusion and women progress. For example, when we work with the private sector, we conduct participatory gender audits, and those audits highlight the gaps, but of course the progress that is in the private sector. But to our surprise, majority of the findings that we got from the private sector, highlighted the gaps, and those gaps were addressed by the private sector by establishing the gender mainstreaming strategies for the private sector, but also for the individual companies. But again, companies have also established gender-sensitive measures to promote gender equality at workplaces by establishing, like, for example, the family-friendly facilities at workplaces that promoted women productivity, establishment of anti-harassment policies, and inclusive decision-making mechanisms that promote women in leadership, but also in other sectors that were traditionally known as male-dominated. We have also observed financial institutions establishing pro-women financial products that facilitated women access to finance and also facilitated women business creation. And all this was as a result of the data that we produced and showed that the private sector was lagging behind in terms of promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. Another example that I could give is that we, as an office, we monitor the electoral processes. You know, our country is known globally in areas of political empowerment, but we achieve that through, of course, through the laws, the constitutions, and the laws of the country, but also through elections. So we monitor elections, mainly the local government and parliamentary elections. And over the years, we have been observing gaps in terms of representation. You know, there were still biases that women were to occupy the social-related positions. But with discussions with different actors, the political actors, the National Electoral Commission, through the civic education programs, we managed to improve that gap. And for example, in the past local government elections, the number of women who are district chairpersons increased from 6% to 27% for district chairpersons, but also we had the same trend in positions like the district mayors and other members of the executive, without also mentioning the number of women in parliament that has been increasing, and we are at the moment at 61%, and which is a number that we hope we can still maintain, because the level of civic engagement that we have in the country, and also the gender responsive electoral processes that we have established as a country will keep us performing in that regards. We also, in terms of preventing GBV and response, we assess the self-delivery that is given in this country. The government of Rwanda has established what we call Isanje One-Stop Center. Isanje is like is a Kinyarwanda word that means feel at home. That is those are the centers that are established in all hospitals of Rwanda. They provide holistic programs to medical services, psychosocial support, legal aid, and criminal processes, criminal investigation processes, and they're all given free of charge in those centers at district hospitals. So we, as an office, we monitor the services that are given. Of course, when you talk about those holistic services, different government ministries, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Justice, and the police, they operate together so that they can ensure that the victims of GBV are given holistic services. So we monitor to ensure that all the services are given, and the gaps and progress that we observe through the assessments are used to improve the services. And finally, another example that I would give is for the sector level profiles, the district profile, the thematic reports, the country status reports also provide information and data that highlights, of course, the progress, but also the gaps. And those information is used to improve the policies that we have, to inform gender responsive budgets, and all of those also contribute to women empowerment of women in this country. So as I conclude, we believe that it is very important to provide timely data, gender data, that allows to effectively respond to gender issues, and also to promoting gender needs effective and consistent system of gender right channel to influence decision making as a country, as we have observed. So the country continues to invest in gender data through the establishment of management information system, decentralizing those services to district levels, and also to establish the national level gender data lab that will consistently produce and disseminate gender data to inform policymaking, programming, and for government and its partners. As I conclude, once again, I thank the UN Women Africa for inviting us, and I hope these discussions will support all of us to continue improving our work in terms of gender equality using production and dissemination of information on gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rurihose. Some very interesting interventions in terms of how you've been able to use data that you collect for both, highlighting what's happening in the private sector, what's happening in government, also to have gender responsive electoral practices. I take your last point, which was having timely gender data, because data is important, but it also needs to be timely to enable very effective interventions that speak to and solve the issues now at the moment. So we've seen what's happening with the media in Kenya, in Africa. We've also seen how this gender data is being used in Rwanda, for both the public and private sectors. But what is the continental perspective? Now, for that, I want to take you to our next speaker, who's a statistician. It doesn't get any better than this. At the African Center for Statistics of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. She, prior to that, was at Uganda's National Statistical Office. And statistics is important. You collect the data, you produce it, you analyze it, and then you disseminate it, and making sure that it's vital and speaking to the immediate and, of course, predicting future needs. For that, ladies and gentlemen, on a continental perspective, Ms. Pamela Nabuhonzo.
Thank you, moderator. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all protocol observed. I would like to start my presentation with just showing us 2 slides before going into the detailed presentation, if you can allow, and I will stick within the time allocated. So the ultimate goal for us investing in women is for us to achieve gender equality. So I'm just going to highlight where we stand, what we have done as Africa, and then the challenges that we face, and then give some few recommendations. What I'm projecting here is basically the percentage of gender gap that has been closed in Africa, of course, comparing Africa with the other continents, which is technically referred to as the gender gap index. So as you see on your left, we have Europe as the best. It has the smallest gap between the women and the men. And then Sub-Saharan Africa, we stand at the 6th position. Then the graph on the right is diving into the details of this gender gap. And the issue here is that we see that there are wider gender gaps in economic participation and opportunity, and also in political participation, in political empowerment. And in education and health, we are doing slightly better, but the picture is different across Africa. And we have Namibia, Rwanda, and South Africa that have closed more than 70% of this overall gap. That means they are doing better than the others. And then we have DRC, Mali, and Chad that are low in terms of the gender coverage. Then this second slide is just basically to tell us that we need data to give that story or to measure what we have. And looking at the chart on the right side, I'm just picking on the SDG 5, where we are looking at the indicators under SDG 5. And when you see the orange bars, they are basically showing us what the number of countries that have sufficient data available to monitor these indicators. And then the gray ones are those with no data. The graph on the right is for all the 17 indicators or goals, and the gray bars again are showing us the number of countries that have no data. So you clearly see that the gray bars are generally longer across all this. And in general, to say Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Tanzania have better positions in terms of data availability. Then we have Botswana, Eswatini, Seychelles, and up to South Sudan that have got a lot of insufficient data. Insufficient meaning they don't have at least 2 data points for the information that they have. So just to quickly explain what are some of those investments in gender data at the regional level that drive change that have taken place. There are regional developments that have picked up pace in strengthening production of gender data in the recent years. One being the landmark Beijing Platform for Action that gave a strong call for action and demand for gender statistics to be adopted as a guiding framework and a policy action tool to make visible the invisible, as already alluded to. And it's almost 30 years since it was signed, and Africa has made important strides in investing in the availability of gender responsive data in order to analyze and respond to gender issues. Secondly, there are Pan-African efforts in place on raising awareness and commitment of gender data. Examples including the Umbrella Platform for Regional Action on Gender Statistics. That's the Africa program on gender statistics that we have. And we also have the Gender Data Network of Statisticians that was alluded to. Then the holding of the annual Gender Statistics Forum is also one of those joint efforts that take place. Now, focusing on what the UNECA and the Economic Commission for Africa has done through the African Center for Statistics under the Africa Program for Gender Statistics, specifically with the support of partners. And here I'm referring to the Africa Development Bank. This year has strengthened the capacity of national statistical systems to mainstream gender issues into the statistical production processes, specifically in censuses, surveys, civil registration and vital statistics, and in the national statistical development strategies. There's ongoing work in Burundi, South Sudan, and Mozambique. And then also to mainstream gender to all these, ECA has developed guidelines, handbooks, and given recommendations. And the second area of intervention is ECA gives direct technical and financial support that is necessary for planning, management of data collection, processing, analysis, dissemination, and the entire process through capacity building workshops, and then also support on harmonization of concepts, definitions, and indicators. And then together with the African Development Bank have regularly produced the Africa Gender Index and the Africa Gender Development Index as advocacy tools to support policy actions towards gender positive changes. The third intervention area is this year has promoted utilization of country-produced data to effectively monitor and report on the 2030 agenda, the Africa Agenda 2063, and national commitments, like I have shown in the first slide that I illustrated. So we see that there are various efforts in place, but gaps exist, as already alluded to by the previous speakers. So this is because of challenges that exist in investing and using data as a vehicle for change. So all is not a disaster, because there are proposals on what can be done to harness the power of gender data. So I'll highlight just 4 challenges that we have noted. Some of these have already been alluded to by the previous speakers. One is that many national statistical offices in Africa have limited technical capabilities to regularly produce and use gender data. So some of these are introducing the artificial intelligence based technologies, and then also using digital innovations, among others. And then others are actually relying on outdated data and paper-based records to provide information on gender. So we therefore recommend the provision of technical assistance, training, and adequate funding to all national statistical systems. So basically, leave no national statistical system behind in giving all this. This is a call to the different partners, actors in the area of gender statistics. The second challenge is the openness and coverage of official data in Africa. Official gender data continues to be a barrier to using data for evidence-based planning. So in short, we are saying that gender data is not freely accessible for use and reuse, as the previous speaker, Dennis, actually alluded to this. So we are saying countries need to adopt and promote open gender data across all the sectors and industries by increasing availability and then accessibility of this data, so that it's capturing all the gender, its intersections for decision-making investments for women. The third challenge is the lack of laws or regulations that govern the production and dissemination of gender statistics, coupled with limited integration of gender data in national policies or development and statistical development strategies. This hampers the use of gender statistics in investment priorities for women. Therefore, countries need strong political will and support to review and adopt legal and political frameworks, as well as to prioritize building their capacities to integrate gender into and across their national policies and plans specifically the national statistical development strategies, in order to advance production and analysis of sex disaggregated data that can inform decision making. And last but not least is financing for gender data has been elusive. Although the official development assistance for gender equality has increased every year since 2015, we note that funding for gender data and statistics has fallen by 55% compared to the average between 2017 and 2019, which is a three times higher than the drop in the funding for data and statistics as a whole. So there's a problem with funding for data and statistics, but when we look to gender data, the problem is worse. But one can also say funding for gender data is difficult to measure because gender is a cross-cutting issue, and support to gender data is because it's integrated in various sectors. Therefore, governments, development partners, and the private sector stakeholders need to prioritize investments in gender data and dissemination. There are existing initiatives by partners and that offer pathways to close the funding gap and ensure the continuous availability of gender statistics. And finally, moderator, is one of the biggest challenges is lack of appreciation of gender statistics and failure to prioritize its funding, which makes essential gender data generally unavailable on challenging issues of our times, like the informal employment, entrepreneurship, time use, the unpaid care and domestic work, and then violence against women and girls and issues of climate change. I trust one of the speakers will delve into these most pressing issues. I thank you and will end at that point.
Thank you very much. I like your conclusion about the challenges and the interventions that are required at the end of it. I will just wrap that up by saying strong political will to support gender data statistics and mainstreaming of that and its use in implementing national policy. And that political will not just be in terms of using the data, but will also be in terms of funding the data that is needed to then, employ different interventions. And thank you for the work that you are doing at the ECA in terms of supporting member states and nations in this regard. Gathering data in general is expensive. It is hard work. It takes some time. But we thank you for doing that in terms of training, providing support, and just helping countries to mainstream gender data in their collection methods. Thank you very much, Ms. Pamela, for that. You've alluded to something which takes us into, in fact, our next topic of the day, which is gender responsive budgeting. So now, once we've got all the data that Pamela and her team have helped nations to sort of gather, what do they then do with that information? How does that then inform the budgeting process? And at what point does it integrate into the budgeting cycle? For that, I would like us to move to our next speaker now, who will tell us a little bit about this and how this works and what we do with that data. So we've gathered it, we've collected it, we've trained people to be able to get us the right information. How does then that translate into the budgets? Because the budget, we know, is the most important tool for any country to guide its economic progress for one financial year, sometimes in the medium term, and the long term as well. Let's move into the second aspect of our time here today. That's gender responsive budgeting. And I'd like to introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Ben Nasser Bolaba, who is the head of the Gender Sensitive Budgeting Division at the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Mr. Ben, floor is yours.
Bonjour Ivan, merci. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Yes, we can hear you.
Donc, merci. C'est pour moi un réel plaisir d'être
sorry, I'm afraid to. Sorry, may I interrupt? May I interrupt, sir?
Oui, oui.
Could you turn on your,
oui.
Could you turn on your camera, please, sir?
Oui, je l'ai allumé. Ça, vous ne voyez pas?
Okay.
D'accord.
Il
est allumé. Il est allumé.
A gray screen.
Oui, oui, j'ai vu. J'essaie d'activer. Il est activé sur le PC. Il est activé, la caméra. Je vais voir comment.
Okay. All right. No, just proceed. We will find you along the way. Please proceed, sir. Apologies for the interruption.
Très bien. Donc, c'est pour moi un réel plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui dans ce webinaire portant sur une thématique très importante qui est l'investissement dans les femmes, comment accélérer ce rythme et ce progrès. J'espère que cette rencontre sera l'occasion de partager avec vous les avancées réalisées par notre pays, par le Maroc, dans le domaine de la budgétisation sensible genre et d'apprendre sur les progrès réalisés par les autres pays africains dans ce domaine. J'ai le grand souhait que ce webinaire permettra de consolider et de capitaliser sur les expériences en matière d'intégration du genre dans la programmation stratégique et la planification budgétaire des institutions et des départements ministériels. Comme vous le savez, le Maroc a entrepris depuis le début des années 2000 une série de réformes constitutionnelles, légales et politiques visant à promouvoir les principes de l'égalité, de l'équité et de la justice sociale conformément à ses engagements internationaux. Dans ce cadre, le Maroc a initié l'expérience de l'intégration de l'approche genre dans la budgétisation sensible genre dans la programmation budgétaire depuis 2002, avec le concours de la Banque mondiale et d'ONU Femmes qui nous ont accompagnés dans ce chantier pour que le budget public puisse bénéficier à tous les citoyens et toutes les citoyennes, mais également qu'une part du budget soit allouée à des programmes qui réduisent les inégalités en femmes et permettent ainsi de développer un développement socio-économique inclusif et durable. C'est ainsi qu'en 2013, le ministère de l'Économie et des Finances a créé le Centre d'excellence pour la budgétisation sensible genre, qui constitue une plateforme de développement d'expertise, de gestion des connaissances et de mise en relation des différents intervenants et intervenantes dans le domaine de la BSG à l'échelle nationale, régionale et mondiale. Concrètement, le Centre d'excellence pour la BSG assure un accompagnement technique rapproché aux ministères et institutions pour l'intégration de la dimension genre tout au long du processus budgétaire et contribue au renforcement des capacités en matière de budgétisation sensible au genre au profit des représentantes et représentants des départements ministériels ainsi que de l'inspection générale des finances, les fonctionnaires d'établissements publics et le collectif des ONG, mais également la Cour des comptes pour mieux cerner cette question de BSG. De ce fait, nous pouvons nous féliciter collectivement de la prise de conscience de l'aspect genre dans les stratégies et les priorités des départements ministériels. Ainsi, à titre d'exemple, au titre de l'exercice 2024, l'analyse des projets de performance sous le prisme de genre a révélé une évolution de la sensibilité genre des programmes budgétaires. Nous avons 64 programmes sensibles genre et 10 programmes ciblés genre. On constate également une évolution de la batterie d'objectifs et d'indicateurs genre qui représentent respectivement 30% et 23% de l'ensemble des objectifs et indicateurs de performance. De surcroît, le Centre d'excellence, avec le concours de ses partenaires, que sont l'Agence française de développement et l'ONU Femmes, se penche actuellement sur un système de marquage genre des dépenses publiques pour évaluer l'état de l'intervention budgétaire en matière d'égalité femmes-hommes et pour pouvoir l'améliorer continuellement. Il s'agit plus concrètement de paramétrer le système d'information budgétaire pour prendre en charge les référentiels qui vont être instaurés pour jauger de la pertinence des programmes budgétaires en matière de lutte contre les inégalités femmes-hommes. Le Centre d'excellence pour la BSG a entamé l'expérimentation du marquage genre auprès de 2 départements ministériels, que sont le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, du préscolaire et des sports, et le ministère de la Jeunesse, de la Culture et de la Communication. D'un autre côté, la transformation digitale constitue un axe stratégique pour le Centre d'excellence, afin d'assurer la diffusion et la capitalisation du savoir-faire en matière de BSG. À cet effet, le Centre d'excellence a procédé à la refonte de sa plateforme Knowledge Management en tant que noyau digital du savoir de la BSG à l'échelle nationale, régionale et globale. Avec plus d'une décennie d'existence, les avancées réalisées par le Centre d'excellence ont permis de hisser le modèle marocain en tant que bonne pratique à l'échelle internationale et a inspiré de nombreuses délégations provenant des régions de la MENA et l'Afrique en vue de s'enquérir de l'expertise et du savoir cumulé par le Maroc en matière de BSG. Mesdames et messieurs, ce webinaire constitue une pierre supplémentaire à l'édifice de la budgétisation sensible au genre pour, in fine, aboutir à une société plus égalitaire et inclusive en Afrique et dans le monde. À cet égard, il représente un espace propice à l'échange des expériences et aux discussions sur les bonnes pratiques, les enseignements tirés et les défis à surmonter afin de tracer dans la durabilité la budgétisation sensible au genre en tant qu'instrument primordial pour avancer en matière d'égalité du genre. Mesdames et messieurs, je ne saurais conclure mes propos sans remercier encore une fois tous les partenaires ici présents pour leur contribution et reste convaincu de l'importance de leur apport et de leur implication auxquels je resterai attentif pour servir nos objectifs et contribuer à l'édification d'un monde que nous voulons plus équitable, plus solidaire et plus prospère. Je souhaite plein succès à vos travaux et merci.
Thank you very much, sir, for that. It's great to hear what's happening in the Kingdom of Morocco, to be able to get an understanding of how you're doing that there. I want us to quickly move to the next country because in this particular session, we have Morocco, we have Cameroon, we've got Uganda, and Liberia, and we will wrap up this particular session with hearing from the Africa Development Bank again for a continental perspective. Next, ladies and gentlemen, I would like us to hear from Cameroon on how they understand and how they are appropriating budget preparation for gender mainstreaming. Each of our speakers has 10 minutes. I kindly remind you to continue to keep within the time as you have so that we can get in as many presentations as possible today. So ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is from Cameroon, Cedric Tiobo, who is the Women Count Lead, UN Women at Cameroon, a man with extensive experience in gathering national statistics and of course enabling capacities of nations to be able to absorb these statistics and make better use of them. Cedric Tiobo, it's now up to you. Go ahead.
Merci bien Yvonne. Bonjour à tous, j'espère que vous me recevez. Donc, permettez que je puisse partager avec vous la structure de cette intervention. S'il vous plaît, est-ce que vous avez mon écran? S'il vous plaît. Are you seeing my screen right now? Please, okay, thank you. So, je vais continuer donc en français. Je vais intervenir sur les thèmes tirer avantage du processus budgétaire pour renforcer l'intégration du genre dans les politiques publiques. Donc, l'objectif de cette communication est de partir des enseignements tirés de l'expérience du Cameroun pour montrer comment, au-delà de mobiliser les fonds pour la cause du genre, la budgétisation sensible au genre offre une passerelle pour ancrer le genre dans les pratiques des institutions publiques depuis le niveau stratégique et pourrait même faire avancer la question des statistiques sur le genre. Et pour ce faire, nous allons procéder en 3 points. En premier, nous allons aborder les éléments clés qui peuvent permettre de comprendre le processus BSI au Cameroun. Ensuite, nous allons voir comment ce processus peut permettre de renforcer l'intégration du genre dans les politiques. Et enfin, nous allons achever avec des opportunités pour le développement des statistiques sur le genre. Donc, concernant le processus BSG au Cameroun, la budgétisation sensible au genre tire son origine dans la loi numéro 2007/006 du 26 décembre 2007 qui porte régime financier de l'État et qui lance ainsi la réforme qui institue la budgétisation par programme. Je pense que c'est quelque chose qui a été adopté par la majorité des pays, sinon tous. Donc, cette loi de 2007 sera révisée plus tard en 2018. Parmi les orientations de cette réforme figure la prise en compte du genre dans le budget. Donc, ainsi, depuis 2013, qui est la première année de mise en œuvre effective de la budgétisation par programme, on a des circulaires présidentielles relatives à la préparation du budget qui intègrent des directives claires quant à l'intégration du genre dans le budget. Ainsi, lors de la préparation du budget, ces budgets des institutions sont évalués, notamment en ce qui concerne la prise en compte du genre dans ce qu'on appelle les programmes budgétaires. Nous approfondirons cet aspect par la suite parce que c'est ça qui est au cœur du renforcement de l'intégration du genre dans les politiques à travers le budget. Et pour faciliter donc cet exercice d'évaluation, un marqueur genre est en cours de finalisation pour opérationnaliser cela. Et aussi, pour terminer avec le processus BSG, il faut dire que depuis 4 années déjà, où on a vu une accélération de l'intégration du genre dans le budget, il est annexé à la loi des finances un document budgétaire sensible au genre qui analyse la prise en compte du genre dans tous les ministères, toutes les institutions et donc dans le budget de l'État. Voilà un peu de façon grossière quelques éléments clés pour avoir une bonne grille de lecture du processus BSG au Cameroun. Maintenant, comment est-ce qu'à partir de là, sur mon deuxième point, on arrive au renforcement de l'intégration du genre dans les politiques à travers le budget? On pourrait concevoir que la budgétisation sensible au genre est la composante financière de l'intégration du genre dans les politiques publiques. Je crois qu'on a tous entendu le mot de gender mainstreaming qui a été lancé justement avec la déclaration de Beijing. Donc, de ce point de vue, la budgétisation sensible au genre cherchera à constituer un fonds dédié à l'égalité des sexes et à l'autonomisation des femmes. Cette conception n'est pas erronée. Seulement, à travers le budget, on peut aller plus loin. Donc, au Cameroun, s'il est bien approprié, le processus pour arriver La budgétisation sensible au genre permettrait au passage d'ancrer encore plus les questions de genre dans la gestion stratégique de toutes les institutions qui bénéficient du budget de l'État. Alors, comment est-ce que cela se passerait? Donc, pour rappel, la budgétisation se fait désormais par programme et en principe, comme je l'ai dit, ça devrait être le cas dans la majorité des pays puisqu'on est passé à la gestion axée sur les résultats qui est opérationnalisée à travers la budgétisation par programme. Donc, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, au Cameroun, on a une circulaire présidentielle de préparation du budget qui donne des directives pour intégrer le genre dans le budget, et ce, à travers les programmes qui feront l'objet de budgétisation. Donc, les programmes contiennent les orientations stratégiques de toutes les institutions qui bénéficient du budget de l'État. Ainsi, lors de la préparation du budget, il existe une instance qui évalue la prise en compte des directives présidentielles, en particulier celles qui se rapportent au genre. Donc, ici, il s'agit de savoir si les objectifs et la stratégie des programmes sont sensibles au genre et aussi si les indicateurs des programmes sont sensibles au genre. Au cas où les programmes ne seraient pas sensibles au genre, des propositions sont faites pour que les manquements soient corrigés lors des révisions des programmes qui interviennent toutes les 3 années, et ce, à partir des orientations de la politique nationale genre qui adresse de façon intégrée toutes les questions du genre. Donc, en conclusion, pour ce deuxième point, l'intégration du genre au sein des institutions publiques est encouragée au-delà du pilotage de la politique nationale genre à travers le budget. C'est-à-dire la vision qui voudrait que ce n'est que l'enveloppe qui augmente par rapport au genre. On a ces résultats, mais au-delà, on entre au niveau opérationnel dans les institutions chargées de la mise en œuvre de la politique publique à intégrer le genre au niveau des orientations stratégiques. Ainsi, le projet Women Count au Cameroun envisage d'appuyer la réalisation des analyses situationnelles dans les institutions qui vont évaluer la prise en compte du genre dans les programmes budgétaires et corriger d'éventuels manquements pour enfin avoir un budget sensible au genre, mais au passage, mieux ancrer la question de genre dans le pilotage stratégique de ces institutions. Voilà un peu comment est-ce que l'intégration du genre, au-delà de la question budgétaire, de façon plus opérationnelle, travaille à améliorer, à gendériser, si je peux utiliser le mot, les politiques, les programmes mis en compte par les ministères. Donc, nous allons terminer avec l'opportunité pour le développement des statistiques sur le genre qui est offerte à travers la budgétisation sensible au genre. Donc, comme on l'a dit tout à l'heure, la budgétisation par programme est l'opérationnalisation de la gestion axée sur les résultats de développement, un mode de gestion dans lequel les résultats sont au centre. Donc, ces résultats sont généralement décrits à partir des statistiques officielles. Souvenez-vous, j'ai dit en début que le point de départ de la budgétisation sensible au genre, c'est la réforme budgétaire. Cependant, cette réforme qui est lancée depuis 2007, pour son opérationnalisation, a investi de nouvelles entités appelées acteurs de la performance, et parmi ces acteurs-là, il n'a pas été tenu compte du système statistique national qui devrait, en principe, fournir les éléments d'appréciation des résultats. Donc, il s'agit là d'une énorme occasion manquée par le système statistique pour mettre les statistiques officielles effectivement au service des politiques publiques. Et on l'a vu, cela s'est traduit par des difficultés au niveau de la gestion des indicateurs lorsqu'il s'est agi d'évaluer la performance dans le nouveau régime financier. Ainsi, la revue des objectifs et des indicateurs des programmes dans le processus budgétaire tel qu'il est fait actuellement offre l'occasion de rattraper cette occasion manquée et de responsabiliser le système statistique pour rendre disponible et à temps les éléments d'appréciation de la performance tenant compte du genre. Donc, ainsi, si on redéfinit les objectifs, les indicateurs des programmes pour essayer de mieux intégrer le genre, au niveau des acteurs qui vont permettre de gérer la performance, on pourrait donc ériger le système statistique tant que responsable des statistiques de genre pour le suivi de la performance. Ce qui fait que le système statistique au niveau institutionnel se retrouve élevé pour et instituer de nouvelles responsabilités pour la production des statistiques de genre. Donc, comme je l'ai dit, les statistiques de genre ainsi que leurs dispositifs de coordination et de production viennent ainsi d'être liés au processus budgétaire et de gestion de la performance. Il s'agit ici, pour les statistiques officielles, d'une plateforme supplémentaire très importante pour l'État. Il s'agit quand même du budget, une question à laquelle les entités publiques sont très sensibles. Donc, cette plateforme qui est susceptible de mobiliser plus efficacement des ressources pour des projets statistiques afin de renseigner sur l'efficacité des actions de l'État. Pour conclure avec cette opportunité, c'est pour dire qu'en réalité, souvent, le constat qui est fait, c'est que les statistiques et le système statistique en général et ceux qui mettent en œuvre les politiques travaillent souvent en silo. C'est le constat qui est fait dans plusieurs pays. Pourtant, il faudrait que ces deux grands ensembles de parties prenantes puissent travailler main dans la main pour que les statistiques produites, d'une part, soient effectivement utilisées pour avoir des résultats qui ont été commentés par les premiers intervenants. Donc, à travers ce processus de budgétisation sensible au genre, il y a une opportunité pour le système statistique de se rapprocher et d'insérer, de créer les conditions pour mettre les statistiques officielles, notamment les statistiques de genre, qui sont produites disponibles et encourager l'utilisation au niveau budgétaire. Par là, on espère que le système statistique aura une oreille plus attentive pour enfin pouvoir résoudre ce problème de financement de l'activité statistique qui revient chaque fois comme difficulté lorsque nous évaluons les systèmes statistiques nationaux. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, sir, for your interventions there. Interesting that this is happening at various stages of development. You're mainstreaming this gender data that then informs that. And it's good to hear that, you know, it's not the portion that happens on the side, but it's been mainstreamed throughout your budgeting process, not just in the immediate term, but for the future as well. Thank you. From Cameroon, let's now go to East Africa, and I'd like us to now hear the case of what is happening in Uganda. For that, Margaret Kakande is our next speaker. She's the head of the Budget Monitoring and Accountability Unit in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda. Ms. Kakande, the floor is yours. Ms. Kakande, can you hear us?
Good afternoon, dear participants.
Good afternoon, Ms. Kakande. Can you turn on? Are you able to turn it on?
Actually, my video is on, but I don't see anything. But it's okay. Let me go on.
Okay, no problem. Please proceed. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, I'm going to share experience in terms of using gender statistics in the budgeting process. So basically for us, we are focusing the use of that statistics at the level of the budget formulation stage, which is basically the first stage in the budget cycle. Just to give you some information that in Uganda, it's a legal requirement for all institutions accessing the national budget to actually show that they are addressing gender and equity issues in terms of their request for the budget. So this came about in 2015 when Parliament passed a law that all ministries, departments, and agencies would actually prove that they are going to address gender and equity issues in their budget framework papers, in their ministerial policy statements. And basing on that, they could then access the budget. So at that time, we had to set up a criteria of assessment, because if somebody says you're going to comply before you access a budget, we had to have a mechanism of proving that somebody is complying. So the law says that the minister responsible for finance would issue a certificate to any institution that complies. And this certificate is based on an assessment that is done by the Equal Opportunities Commission to show that that institution has actually addressed inequalities. So we come up with an assessment criteria, and within that criteria, implicitly institutions are actually being forced to use gender statistics. So there are five levels of assessment that we look at before a certificate is issued. One The first question is, has this institution been able to identify what the gender and equity issues are in that institution? So it can be at two levels. The issues can be within the institution, or they can be within the services or goods that the institution does deliver to the public. So that is the first step. And before an institution can identify the gender and equity inequalities, you must use statistics to be able to actually identify that we have this gender gap here, and this is that, and it's actually an issue that has to be addressed. Of course, you can look at the time frame when this is going to be done. So there are marks which are given to that. Suffice to say that right now, our pass mark is 50. So when we assess all these 50, the 5 levels that I'm going to describe, you must be able to get at least 50% of the marks before you are issued a certificate. So the second level of assessment, we look at the strategies. Within the strategies of all the interventions that you're proposing to do in a given financial year, do we have strategies which are going to address the gender and equity issues that you've identified? And these strategies can be at 2 levels. Are they what we call universal strategies, which are basically mainstream? And basically in this kind of interventions, you look at a mechanism where you say, we are going, for example, let me use an example of education. When you say we are going to have an intervention that will address all inequalities, we shall put up maybe classrooms in all the remote areas. If you do that, implicitly, you're going to look at issues of inequality, or the marginalized girls and boys will be able to go to school. But when we are assessing, we give you some small marks. Because what we really want to see in that kind of assessment is, do you have anything which is basically specific? Do you have specific interventions that are going to address inequalities? So, for example, in that case of education, are you talking about issues of menstrual hygiene? How much are you going to allocate to that? Are you looking at other issues of sanitation within the facilities, within the schools? So in that case, when you give us something which is more specific in terms of addressing the issues, you earn more marks. Then we look at the specific allocations in terms of budgets. This is where the money comes in. So in terms of us assessing how well you're doing the budget allocations, again, we ask ourselves, where is your money? Most of it. Are you putting most of your money on the universal strategies, or how much are you putting on the specific interventions? And of course, we also look at how much, because one of the key challenges that we're faced with in terms of addressing gender inequality are the issues of tokenism. People have this practice of tokenism, throwing a few shillings here and there, and they think that they are going to be addressing issues of gender. So in this case, we look at how much you're putting on universal, how much you're putting on specific interventions, and how much. And even there, we give you marks. Then level 4, we look at your monitoring and evaluation framework, because basically you're supposed to tell us performance indicators. Within a financial year, how will you know that you've actually achieved the results? So the question then will be, in these indicators, do we have in gender or equity responsive indicators that talk to the issues that you identified? And if they are actually smart indicators at that level, again, you earn some marks. And then level 5 is when we are looking at the issue of reporting. Because basically when somebody's coming up with either a budget homework paper or a ministerial policy statement, usually give us some background in terms of past performance. So we look at the way you're reporting past performance. Are you giving us data that is disaggregated in terms of what you did the past financial year? What did you achieve in terms of results for the selected levels of service delivery for the various groups? If you do that, again, you earn marks. So you can see that in that process of assessing institutions before they are certified, we are implicitly actually forcing institutions to use gender statistics. But of course, then somebody can ask that, do all the institutions have people who have capacity in terms of being able to actually get the data that is disaggregated, analyze it, and be able to actually feed it at all those various levels? And I would say no. And we did realize that that is a challenge. And we had a stopgap measure of supporting our institutions in terms of how can they actually be certified with the inadequate capacity that they may have. So in the short term, we did commission consultants, and we came up with what we call sector compacts. And more recently, we've come up with program handbooks. So what are these? These compacts are basically small booklets. For example, for each sector has a small booklet, and this booklet has done an analysis of statistics in a given sector, identified the key issues in that sector, identified a number of strategies. It will be now for you to choose what is most appropriate and what is feasible in a given financial year. And it has also specified the monitoring and evaluation indicators. So you can see that at 3 levels, we've tried to make it easy as a stopgap measure for institutions to have this product on the shelf, which you can just pick and actually just at least get 3 levels of input: the issues, the strategies, and the performance indicators. But in the medium term, we didn't think that this is something that will be very useful as a country. So we came up with a capacity building plan. We came up with a 5-year capacity building plan. And basically, this plan was to ensure that all the officials who are in planning, who are in budgeting, who are in monitoring and evaluation, know how to use gender and equity disaggregated statistics. So in this case, in that capacity building plan, we came up with a training curriculum. And one of the modules in that curriculum is how to use statistics to identify gender and equity issues. It's a full module. And this curriculum has been institutionalized. We have it in our civil service college. This is a college that orients public servants when they're recruited, which creates on-job training and so on. So we thought that this would be the place where people can actually go for refresher courses. Those who are coming into the service can be actually introduced to these concepts. And another module that we have in that curriculum is gender and equity responsive monitoring and evaluation. So you find that we are looking at how it will be sustainable in terms of our officials being able to do what we are assessing in terms of budget formulation, but in the long term. So we have that curriculum, and we've trained a number of officials, both in the central governments and also in the local governments. And to be able to do that, we actually trained what we call certified national gender and equity budgeting trainers. And these people are also certified. So they are now we have about 52. They are certified, and the purpose was for us to ensure that we have some degree of standardization in terms of capacity building, and we talk the same language when we're training, whether it is at the local government or whether it is at the level of the center. So basically, that's how we are actually approaching this use of statistics. And the good thing is our National Bureau of Statistics has a strategy for developing gender statistics. So we are working hand in hand for them. They're developing the data, supporting institutions to generate this data. And on our side, we are actually promoting the use of that data in the budgeting process. And like I said, we are mainly focusing at the stage of budget formulation in terms of encouraging institutions to be able to use that data at that level. I want to thank you.
Thank you. What fantastic news and interventions we are hearing from Uganda. And I guess it is important to continue to train people on how to use the data, making no assumptions, because having the data and generating that is one thing, but then how to use it to actually interpret what's really happening on the ground. And I like that ministries and departments have to actually prove that they're making interventions to close the gender gap in their various sectors before they can access the budget. What a great tool that you've shared, and that we can all continue to learn from. You see, that's what these sessions are about, to see what's happening across the continent. And there's some good work that's happening. More needs to be done, but there's also quite a bit that has already been done from what we've heard in Morocco, in Cameroon, and now in Uganda as well. We're moving on to the next country case study. And just 2 reminders that I have at this point to all our speakers to please keep within the allocated time. We're falling behind, but that's not a bad thing because we're hearing very good things and we're able to share amongst ourselves. So please keep to the time that is allocated to each of you for your presentations. And that is 10 minutes for the next 2 speakers. So I kindly remind you to continue to keep to the time allocated. My second reminder here today is that we've got the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please go there. There's quite a bit of interaction that's happening. There are questions, comments, interventions that you've got, and there's interaction that is happening back and forth. So please share your thoughts with us on that so that we can hear from you as well. And so our next speaker is all the way from Liberia, and we want to understand how they're linking public spending to gender-sensitive results. Sarah Malba is in charge of gender-responsive planning and budgeting at Liberia's Ministry of Finance and Development Planning. Ms. Sarah, please give us the state of what's happening in your country in the next 10 minutes, please. Thank you. Ms. Sarah, are you there? Can you hear us? All right. It would seem she cannot hear us, or perhaps is not on the call. Though we really wanted to hear the interventions that the Ministry of Finance is taking in Liberia. She is not on the call at the moment. It would be great to get to hear from her. But let's wrap up this session now and get a continental perspective. So we've taken a trip around Africa, from Morocco in the north to Cameroon, Uganda in the east. So what is really happening across Africa in terms of gender-responsive budgeting? What are some of the interventions that are being made, the support, the capacity building and research that is taking place at the Africa Development Bank? For this, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from Lynette Miriti Otieno, who's the Chief Gender Officer at the African Development Bank based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Lynette?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Yvonne. And it's actually very difficult for me to speak after the experiences from the countries, because the actual experiences are really from the countries and not from the bank. But I want to sort of speak around financing generally, and then see some of the opportunities that we have to advance gender responsive budgeting, as well as the use of statistics. Now, gender responsive budgeting, of course, is about fiscal policies and throwing a little bit of a spanner in the works, saying there's quite a change and a shift in the development finance architecture in Africa and globally. And there's, of course, we've seen the shift from aid-funded development to debt and to domestic resource mobilization. So this has an implication then on how we position gender responsive budgeting, but also the criticality of gender responsive budgeting, especially when governments are now really shifting to domestic resource mobilization. And this is where we see falling, in some cases, lower levels of financing coming from development aid and more loans and all that. Now, we've also seen an emergence of new actors, China, India, the BRICS. We are seeing a focus on climate funds, on public-private partnerships. And all these have implications on how gender equality is financed, but also how we implement gender-responsive budgeting. Now, of course, many countries across Africa are unable to finance the needs for development, and also resulting in the issuance of foreign sovereign debt. But in the last couple of years, we also see emerging needs that mean that they're shifting priorities. We had the 3 C's. We've had the 3 C's: COVID-19, conflict, climate change. And there's a lot of shifting in how budgets are prioritized. And as we saw this, especially around the COVID-19, but also when the war in Ukraine broke up, governments had to reshift and to prioritize budgeting. And some of the examples in some countries, for instance, in Kenya, was even removal of subsidies. In many countries, removal of subsidies in fuel, and these have impacts. Now, before I go into really the gender budgeting issues, I started to look at where our countries in Africa get their resources. Internally, most of the resources are from what I mentioned earlier: domestic resource mobilization. It's from remittances. It's from foreign direct investments, but also the domestic financial markets. But then we also have financing coming from ODA, grants, and concessional loans. And then we have another whole list that is non-official development assistance, overseas development assistance, where we've got the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, for instance, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and others, philanthropies, grants and loans from non-DAC donors, but also climate finance. And all these are the pots where resources are coming from. Now, the question I ask is, when we discuss gender responsive budgeting, are we taking into account all these other sources of money, or is it just that which goes into the national budget, which is mainly as a result of domestic resource mobilization or the domestic financial markets? Are we also looking at all these other sources of financing? So this is the entire landscape I believe that we've got to look at. Now, it's therefore an imperative that GRB is important to ensure that all these sources of financing for development do contribute to gender equality. Now, I want to speak a little bit about I'll mention a few of the things that I've heard from some of the speakers in terms of what are the critical preconditions necessary. Then I'll share a little bit about what the African Development Bank has done and some opportunities. I think one of the things that has come out clearly is that gender responsive budgeting and even the use of statistics is political as much as it's technical. So we cannot advance both with the statistics and the gender responsive budgeting without critical political will. Because the fiscal process is really a political process. Now, secondly, it's very bureaucratic process and there's need for skills. I think Margaret, the previous speaker, has really talked about how Uganda has done with a very technical process of checks and balances, but also building capacities. But also we've had that gender responsive budgeting must intersect with data systems. So it is the data that actually makes the case for gender responsive budgeting. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the African Development Bank and some of the instruments that we have used or processes that we have used to support this. One of the key instruments the bank uses for lending to member countries is what we call policy-based lending, or rather budget support. Now, between 2020 and 2023, as a result of the COVID crisis, the food crisis, we have seen increasingly countries borrow from the bank to offset the budget deficits. What it means is that rather than provide financing for specific investments, these resources go into the budget. And now, in this case, it's been very important, therefore, that gender responsive budgeting is applied, but not every country has applied, has the tools or the systems for gender responsive budgeting. So what we have done as the bank is whenever we have had these opportunities is then to look at policy measures. Maybe let me just step back with how the policy-based lending works. The bank puts resources into a budget and through a dialogue process with the government, identify policy measures and triggers that must be met for disbursements to take place. And this has been a really good space to advance gender responsive budgeting. So what I would like to say today, beyond sharing what we are doing, is that increased dialogue between ourselves, the other multilateral development banks, will ensure that when these dialogues happen, there's ability to identify key gender policy measures that can actually be included as trigger actions for disbursement. You can imagine if we have 30 countries borrowing using this instrument, and in each of those, we included a policy measure on gender responsive PFM or gender responsive budgeting. You can imagine how much quicker that would advance on this issue on the continent. So for me, this is a call to closer collaboration, both with governments, both with partners like UN Women, so that we can know which policy measures that we can include in the dialogues that we have with governments. Now, because often the budget support seems like a Treasury, African Development Bank conversation, but there's actually room to include aspects of responsive budgeting there. Now, the other instrument we use is the institutional support projects. This is where we build capacity of governments on public financial management. And it's another space that we can actually advance the discussions both on data, but also on gender responsive budgeting. Now, back to the budget support. Beyond the national level, a lot of countries are also do come for financing for specific sector budget support. And this is again where it helps stepping down now the policies from a national level to a sector level. So for instance, this year we have a number of countries where we'll be dialoguing on sector, agriculture sector reform, budget support, or energy sector. So these are also areas that need to be interrogated because, and I'll talk about the example of energy sector support, where sometimes the support, some of the policy actions might be the removal of subsidies. The question then is, what is the impact of those subsidies on poorer and vulnerable households? How are the savings gained from removal of subsidies used to enhance other social sectors spending? So there's a lot of need for data and analysis on programs like this so that it can actually inform this. But often there's very little time when these discussions are happening to effectively inform. Now, the other issue, I think as I complete, is just to say that gender responsive budgeting is really just one of the aspects of the public financial management ecosystem. And so there'll be need to look at other parts of that, whether it is actually the actual resource mobilization, looking at issues of gender and taxation, looking at the accountability mechanisms. And then finally, just to bring in what we are doing on statistics, and because it's very critical, a lot of it has already been mentioned by, I think it was Pamela who spoke earlier from ECA. The support we are doing, especially on countries in transition, to build gender responsive statistical systems. She did mention the work together with ECA in 4 countries: Burundi, Mozambique, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. But in addition to that, the bank also generally supports larger statistical capacity building. But there's now need to really link this with the gender responsive budgeting. Then finally, the bank and ECA produce the African Gender Index, which is really our tool for dialogue for the advancement of gender equality. So I want to end here, but say gender responsive budgeting. My call is to look at the holistic development financing architecture and see how all that architecture then contributes to advancing gender equality and empowerment of women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and talking about the work that you are doing with supporting governments in that respect, and also the areas of collaboration with UN Women in terms of identifying some of those gender policies that you can incorporate when providing budgetary support to various member states. Lynette Miriti-Otieno, we thank you for your time and your interventions here today and for the work that you continue to do. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us to move to another topic. It's the last but definitely not the least. As we talk about investing in women and accelerating progress, one of the biggest areas to do that is in the care economy, or the purple economy, as we call it now. What are the contributions of women in that respect? And how do we measure and quantify that contribution and therefore then, incorporate it into what it's building into our economies, and how we can quantify that. Like we've said here all day so far, what you cannot measure, you cannot monitor, and therefore you cannot change and perhaps cannot incorporate into policy making. So ladies and gentlemen, now we want to talk about the care society and how we implement gender responsive financing in that regard. Our next speaker is one who is very passionate about this. She's the policy advisor for women economic empowerment at UN Women. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Mejabin Alarakia. Please welcome and give us your remarks on this.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Would be good to see you as well. Okay, you're sharing your screen. Go ahead. All right.
Yes, my camera is on, so I hope that those who can see my screen.
We can see you now, and we can see your screen. Thank you.
Excellent, great, thank you. So I will go through this relatively quickly because of the time issues, but given the request to understand what is the care economy, the purple economy, I will take us quickly through this. So let's see if the slide will change. There we go. So what is care work? Overall, care work is anything that's emotional and physical care that is actually a requirement of all human beings. And it is the work that's needed to recreate day after day the physical, emotional well-being of people as humans. So that's sort of the broad definition. And we want to also highlight here that it's appropriate and satisfying. And it's not just material, it's also that soft aspect of interpersonal relations, how we grow families, how we grow children, what is in our societies, our communities, our cultures. So this is all very, very important to human existence. It is also, it can also be difficult. It can also be fulfilling. Playing with the children, for example, might be a lot more fulfilling than taking care of an elderly, aging, sick person, for example. On the other hand, it also includes the things we need for life, including, doing laundry, domestic work, cleaning, etc. in the household. So it's really the full broad range of things that we do as humans. In the sort of more structural sort of sense, we look at it in two different aspects. We have unpaid work, which is historically the transformation of unpaid work and domestic work. And we want to look at transforming that into paid work, which can be a driver of economic growth. And this is how now it links back to our conversations today around investing in women. So unpaid work or unpaid care work sits in two sort of areas. There's direct care and indirect care. And there's supervisory kind of care and then active care, which we will talk a little bit about. Just to break it up over sort of the life cycle, right? So as a human being, as when we're born and we're little children, the need for care is extremely high. At this point, you as a human being, you aren't able to take care of yourself or survive. And if you were left without care, it would really be the end. And then as we start to grow, you get into your teenage years, you still need care, but not in the same way. You can take care of yourself, you can bathe, you can make basic meals, but you kind of still need someone around to do some things for you. As we become adults, we then become sort of overall independent human beings and able to take care of ourselves. However, even there, we do need there is still some need for care. For example, for each one of us to be here today, there is somebody behind us supporting us with some of the cleaning, the household, the chores, those sort of things for us to be here. For someone to go to work, there needs to be somebody to do the laundry. And in the case when there isn't someone to do the laundry and you're doing it all yourself, you then need the state and market services, for example, to come in to support you. So you may hire a domestic worker to help you with some of the things you need to do. Or you have the state providing, for example, running water into your household so you don't have to go and fetch water, and therefore looking at reducing sort of the time burdens that we would have otherwise. And then as we move on into our elderly years, then some of that need for care comes back. And that one, it varies, right? Because sometimes you may have a 70 or 80-year-old person who's fully capable of taking care of themselves. In other cases, you have people with a lot more needs at that point and aren't able to take care of yourself. So the point of this is that as we go through our life cycle, the care needs sort of change depending on where we are and what context we live in. It also, just want to make a nuance point here, is that it also varies if you're in urban settings or rural settings. So a 42-year-old person in a urban setting will have a lot more services in place to support them compared to a 42-year-old in rural settings who might need to fend for themselves in terms of fetching water, firewood, lighting, etc., etc. So this is very variable depending on where in life we are and where in the world we are. However, when we look at the amount of time that's spent on this, and this is a graph that shows the global statistics. So each one of these sort of columns here is the world, Africa, Americas, Arab states. So you can see, you know, this across the world, what's happening. The blue is the unpaid care work that's done. The orange is the paid work that's done. So this looks at what is the time in minutes that's being spent. And then each of these columns is women and men. Now, there's 2 points I want to highlight here. One is that this line here, I'm hoping you can see the upper black line. This is the line that is indicative of the amount of time women spend on unpaid care work across the world. So here you see this one is about 265 minutes. This one is at 263 minutes, 268 minutes in the Americas, 329 higher in the Arab states. But then you go to Asia Pacific, 262, Europe and Central Asia, 272. And then you look at low income countries, 262. So the point here is that across the world, regardless of which part of the world you look at, women spend about 265 or so minutes a day on unpaid care and domestic work. This is compared to the lower black line, which shows men. And again, here you see it's 83, 78, gets a bit higher in the Americas, stays about the same in the Arab states, gets a bit lower in Asia Pacific, a bit higher in Eastern Europe. And then you have, again, around the same. So there's a bit more variation here, but you see that men spend about the same amount across the world. And then you see the orange bars, and you see across the board, you see men doing a lot more paid work and women doing a lot less paid work. The final point to raise here is that across the world, the total day of a woman, if you combine the unpaid and paid work, is longer than the day of a man. So this is how we could use data to sort of start to understand what's going on in the world around us and how that compares to other spaces. Now, in the next slide, we get more into this, and I'm just very quickly going to use the demonstration of how we can use data to inform our policymaking. Here, this is the 2019 Kenya population pyramid from the census, and you see from this that there's a very low population sort of at the elderly phase, but the people under 10 to 15, so under 15 are the bulk of the population, which means if you started to say, so what does that mean for our care work and our care needs? It means that over the next 70 or 80 years to the end of the century, the population of 25 to 64 will be the biggest population, which is the same thing right now. But look at this growth that we start to see. But you also start to see that after 2030, 2040, the elderly population starts to grow and becomes a significant part of the population, which isn't the case right now where we are. So in terms of policy and planning and looking at GRB and looking at how data and statistics can help us, This is an indication of the kind of needs that we're going to have going into the future for our population, for example, in Kenya. And then this can help policymakers to say, okay, then we need to start investing in systems that are going to be able to be supportive of this population 20 years from now, so that we're not looking at sort of a reactive policy environment, but more proactive. And the reason I wanted to also raise this is because there is a clear connection between what is happening in the care sector, mostly in the unpaid care work, and within the paid care work in the economy. So there's two aspects, and many of you will be familiar with domestic workers, but we also have care workers in the healthcare sector, in the education sector, and across the other sectors of the economy. So there are services that can be paid for. And what we look at is what we call the care diamond, where we have sort of four key sectors of the economy, which is the state at the top here, the community and civil society, the market, and household. These are the sort of four locations where we provide care services. And then domestic, for example, domestic employment sits sort of between the market and the household. And this is where a lot of our care services are provided. So the key takeaway so far is that women are mostly responsible for the unpaid care work in the household. And the unpaid care work is economically important. It enables all of us to be here today. It enables the society to function as it does. And it also enables the development of the future labor force. And then I will go now into the 5R strategy. So some of you may have heard of this. It is in the SDG targets. In the SDG target 5.4, it falls under SDG 5, target 5.4. It's called the 3R strategy, recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work. But this was developed, in 2013, 2014, as we were developing the SDGs. We now also have two more R's, so it's no longer the 3R strategy, it's the 5R strategy now, where we look at reward and represent care workers. The first three look at recognizing, measuring, and this is what many of you have talked about, and we will talk, I think, a bit more about how we measure, how we look at it, what does it mean. Reducing it, which includes investing in services to reduce unpaid care work like fetching water, and then redistributing, so looking at how we redistribute within the household and state and market services, but also within the household, so that we can ensure that men and women and other members of the household can also share the responsibilities of care. And then reward is ensuring that we have an equal sort of pay system for those who are in this, and then representing, ensuring that they have a voice as they are able to ask for their needs and requests as workers. So this brings me to the last slide that I have, which is the purple economy. And this is what the moderator has also been mentioning. The purple economy fits very much into the 5R strategy and the broader conversation around the care economy, and can fit also into the GRB conversations that we've been having. The four pillars are universal social care infrastructure, and this looks at investments such as child care facilities or elderly care facilities or other such facilities. And this redistributes between the household and the state services in terms of the provision of care. The second looks at labor market regulation, and this is also something that all of us can really play a part in, is on how we ensure that workers, not just care workers, but workers like me and you, are able to have a balance between their work life and their home life, and be able to balance between their care responsibilities. The third one looks at physical infrastructure, and this is where the issues such as water infrastructure fall in, and how we establish those services so that we reduce the unpaid care work burdens. And then also looking at the enabling environment. So this really looks at how we bring in social protection systems, old age pensions, universal healthcare systems, so that the care responsibilities are again shared between the household and the state, but also with the market services. So this is super quick on what the care economy is. And this is just the references of that we referred to here. And just to note that this was a presentation that was developed in partnership with the, or on a previous partnership with the IMF, and also with the Women Count program of UN Women. Thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
I think that was a quick masterclass in care work. the different facets of it, how to recognize it, reward it, and its key contributor to the growth of economies across the different societies, giving us a global perspective, but also narrowing it down to what's happening on the continent. I think we're all the better for it now with that very clear understanding of where we are with that. Thank you very much for that, Mejabin, and for the work that you continue to do in this space, in this sector, and to raise awareness on this, particularly rewarding that and of course how important it is. Let's get a case study of just what this means, and let's hear that from Senegal, where we'll take a look at the time use, the care economy, and how they're working to implement gender-responsive financing. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us to hear from our next speaker, and that would be Ms. Sadio Kanute, who's the Minister of Gender, Head of Gender Statistics and Studies Office at the Gender Equity and Equality Department. She's from the ministry rather than the minister. Do we have Ms.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis là. Bonjour.
Bonjour, merci, bienvenue.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Ok, d'accord. J'aimerais vous faire la présentation, bien discuter avec vous sur l'utilisation du temps, l'économie des soins et mise en œuvre de financement sensible aux gens. Comment ça se fait ici au niveau du Sénégal. Juste avant de commencer, juste rappeler un peu le contexte ici au Sénégal en termes d'économie des soins. Juste noter que notre pays a une économie en développement et une population en croissance rapide, dont 50,2% sont des femmes. Et sur ces 50, il y a 54,8% de la population féminine qui sont en âge de travailler. Donc, la plupart d'entre elles effectuent des soins non rémunérés qui ne sont pas pris en compte dans les produits intérieurs bruts. Compte tenu de cela, il y a lieu aussi de souligner que notre pays a récemment fait en 2021 l'enquête d'emploi du temps pour une première dans ce pays et aussi suivi de la réalisation du compte satellite des ménages. En termes d'initiative, il faut reconnaître que le Sénégal a beaucoup apprécié cette enquête qui est venue en appui sur ce que le gouvernement avait eu à faire bien avant l'enquête de temps, c'est-à-dire l'existence de quelques initiatives gouvernementales que je m'en vais vous citer en termes juridiques. Nous pouvons noter il y a la Constitution qui prend en compte ces questions de travail, de soins non rémunérés. En plus de cela, il y a eu une stratégie nationale pour l'égalité des genres qui est arrivée à notre document de politique qui consacre des aspects essentiels pour la prise en compte des soins de travail non rémunérés. Pour dire que l'État reconnaît ces soins, mais aussi prend en compte ces politiques. Il y a aussi une autre stratégie spécifique aux femmes qui est la stratégie nationale pour l'autonomisation des femmes, qui évoque prône l'évolution des modèles sociaux en faveur de la parité des genres et s'appuie sur deux leviers dont la réduction de travail de soins non rémunérés et aussi il y a la stratégie nationale de développement de la statistique qui a intégré l'aspect genre dans sa troisième stratégie. Toujours en termes d'aspect juridique, nous pouvons un peu lister comment cette enquête a pu sensibiliser, comment dire, récemment, il y a eu une loi en révisant les codes de disposition du 1er décembre 2017 portant du code du travail relatif à la non-discrimination du travail. Tout ça, c'est des évolutions qui montrent la ferme volonté de l'État d'appuyer dans cette dynamique. Il y a aussi une loi sur le travail, code du travail relatif à la protection de la femme en état de grossesse qui protège les droits des femmes dans ce sens. Et récemment, le ministère de la Femme aussi a mis en place un décret fixant les conditions d'ouverture et d'organisation de fonctionnement des structures de prise en charge des enfants âgés de 0 à 3 ans, c'est-à-dire les enfants qui sont dans les crèches communautaires pour montrer comment c'est développé dans notre pays. Toujours en termes d'initiative, bien avant même l'enquête du temps, il y a eu des programmes qui étaient là sensibles aux questions de travail de soins non rémunérés. Il y avait le programme national de développement local qui contribue à l'amélioration de l'accès des populations rurales à des services de qualité. Le programme comprend une composante sur les soins de travail non rémunérés axée sur le renforcement des capacités des communautés locales pour réduire le fardeau des soins non rémunérés, en particulier pour les femmes et les jeunes filles. Il y a aussi le programme de bourse de sécurité familiale qui fait des transferts monétaires en vue de réduire la pauvreté et améliorer la sécurité alimentaire des ménages vulnérables. Il dispose une composante de soutien aux soins non rémunérés, de transferts monétaires supplémentaires pour les ménages qui prennent soin des membres vulnérables de leur famille, notamment les jeunes enfants. Aussi, il y a une stratégie sur le développement de la petite enfance qui comprend une composante en faveur des soins non rémunérés, dont le renforcement des capacités des familles et des communautés afin de fournir des soins de qualité pour ces enfants, de manière à libérer les femmes de leur charge de travail liée aux soins non rémunérés à travers l'implication des personnes âgées, des conseillers familiers, entre autres. Toujours en termes d'initiative, il y a la couverture maladie universelle, un outil qui permet de mettre en place un système efficace de financement de la santé et contribuer à la réduction du travail de ces femmes avec l'enrôlement de la majorité d'entre elles dans des mutuelles de santé qui les confortent un peu dans ce sens. Aussi, en termes de financement sensible aux gens, il faut reconnaître que le Sénégal dispose d'un budget, d'un document budgétaire sensible aux gens depuis 2016, annexé à la loi de finances. Mais il faut noter que ça a été renforcé avec cette enquête sur l'emploi du temps. Et actuellement, dans tous les ministères, il y a des cellules genre qui sont chargés d'appuyer à ce que, de veiller à ce que cette prise en compte du budget genre soit une réalité. Il y a aussi des réflexions en cours, notamment sous le lead du ministère de la Femme et du ministère du Travail, pour que dans tous les services ministériels de notre pays, de disposer des garderies d'enfants. Il y a certaines qui en disposent, mais ce n'est pas encore effectif. Donc, on va dans ce sens pour que ça soit effectif. Il y a aussi en matière de budgétisation sensible au genre, le Sénégal tend vers une stratégie budgétaire sensible au genre pour une meilleure prise en compte de ces questions de budget sensible au genre. Et récemment, il y a eu des sessions de renforcement des acteurs pour leur permettre de mieux prendre en compte ces aspects, de comment intégrer les aspects genre dans les politiques publiques, surtout les genres des ministères clés comme l'économie et les finances. Aussi, notre ministère a eu un partenariat avec ONIFAM dans le cadre d'un projet qu'on appelle 3R. Et il y a eu une feuille de route qui a été même mise en place et une arrêté en cours pour que cela soit une réalité, pour pousser les réflexions, mener les plaidoyers, afin que les charges de travail des femmes puissent être dupliquées et que dans les budgets, on prend en compte toutes ces sortes de considérations. En termes de recommandations, c'est juste des recommandations pour faire le plaidoyer pour que les questions de soins de travail non rémunérés puissent être prises en compte dans notre PIB. On est dans ce sens, dans cette logique, et on aimerait vraiment pousser dans ce sens avec la réalisation des comptes satellites qui nous a montré les réels chiffres. Cela nécessite de faire le plaidoyer afin que cela soit pris en compte. Renforcer les initiatives gouvernementales relatives à la reconnaissance, la réduction, la redistribution des travaux de soins non rémunérés, mais aussi impliquer les communautés dans la prise en charge de ces 3R, promouvoir les actions et mesures permettant aux femmes de concilier les deux vies familiales et professionnelles, telles que les crèches, comme je l'ai tantôt dit. Donc, pourquoi pas même aller vers des télétravail pour les femmes qui sont en allaitement. Mais aussi veiller à la périodicité des données pour une meilleure suivi des indicateurs sensibles aux gens, c'est important et les données nous permettent de faire le maximum et c'est important d'aller dans ce sens. C'était ça ma petite contribution par rapport à cette thématique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. It is great to hear what is happening in Senegal. What are some of the challenges and how you propose to address those? Like we've said, I think throughout with all our sessions today that it is work in progress. Some have figured some parts out, others are still figuring other areas out as well in terms of what it means to invest in women and how to accelerate the progress, and all of that using gender data as the basis and the foundation for evidentiary-based policy making, decisions, regulatory and legal framework formulation as well in that respect. So we've heard what's working, what is not, where the challenges are, what more we need to do, but also some beautiful stories of how to be able to convert that data. I mean, I think when we started at the beginning, it was about the nexus between data generation and production, dissemination of the same, storytelling, and then the impact of that data in terms of moving the needle forward when it comes to the promises and the commitments we have made as a human race in Africa towards Agenda 2063 and across the world with the SDGs, which are now just about less than 7 years away, actually less than 6 now. So I would like us to now close our session here today. There have been some really great interventions. I've seen some great comments as well. Ms. Isabella Schmidt, who's the co-director of the program, has done quite well in terms of interacting with you on the Q&A section. Oganga Kaneble says, great presentation, Mejabin. Chinelo Chikelu, I think poses a question there to Pamela Nabukonzo on the sources of the retrieval data in Nigeria and what Nigeria is doing right in terms of collection and availability of gender-responsive data and what gaps still exist there. If you can, in the next few minutes that we've got left before we close, please go on there and respond to some of those. I just want to also thank Patrick Gomane for your comment. I saw that earlier regarding gender data assets and more gender nuanced data that is available, and you've given us a link there. So let's share all of this and get out as much information as we can. Also giving us the case of South Africa, where you say you've reached or collected data of just over 8,000 women entrepreneurs in both the formal and informal sector. And how the data is being used to inform the work around gender-responsive policy and practices, both in the public and the private sector. Good work with what's happening in South Africa there. Patrick Omane, thank you very much for that. Also, seeing the comment or question here from Mona Tazora from the Sudan Country Office, and the intervention there by Isabella Schmidt. So let's do that. We've got just a few minutes left. I would like us to close this. Do we have Ms. Antonia on the line? She was with us earlier and gave us opening remarks. At the start of that, we would like to then have her close our ceremony here so far today. And there have been hundreds of participants that we've seen here. And also remember, we've been online, and even as we talk about International Women's Day, that's coming up just 2 days from now. Remember, it's International Women's Month, and so this is just one of the events that UN Women is using to mark this. There are several others in collaboration with other partners, other organizations, both in civil society and at government level. So I think now to close our time here today, Ms. Isabella Schmidt, co-director of this program. Ms. Schmidt?
Yes, good afternoon again. Yvonne, thank you so much for your very eloquent chairing and facilitation of the session. Your professionalism and the fact that you've got so much experience in pulling out the most important key points that speakers raise, etc., is well appreciated and noted. I also would like to appreciate all the speakers from various national statistical offices and governments across the continent. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your experiences and achievements. I think we have a lot to be proud of, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done, as was highlighted, opportunities to look for financial partnerships and other kind of partnerships have been highlighted through the African Development Bank, and also the ECA speakers. So we have now marching orders. Let's continue to produce good gender data and strive to use international statistical best practices as we do so, but in the same time realize that if we continue to produce data just because it's data and it's not being used, we will absolutely miss the point. So let's try and make our data more accessible, more specific, and speaking to the specific needs of users. And then we also want to commend the media who joined and provided some insights into how they use data. Thank you for that. Until the next time we meet, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks a lot for joining us today. Over to you, Yvonne, maybe for final remarks.
Thank you, Isabella. I cannot have any final remarks after you and all the great speakers we have had here over the last few hours. Mine's just to wish you all a happy International Women's Day, happy International Women's Month, and let's continue to work together and collaborate to making all of the commitments a reality. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and wishing you well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.